Hello and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. And this is our review of the year. And what a year it's been politically. All change, of course, in the UK with a landslide victory for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. But somehow it doesn't feel like a government that's very stable. Somehow it seems a government which is in permanent crisis. So we're going to rake over just what that election means for UK politics, not only in 2024, but looking ahead. In Scottish politics, well, it looked as if there was a realignment of sorts. In fact, there was a realignment, given how good a night that Labour had. The polls are suggesting that that realignment ain't going to last all that long. 2024 did look like the year when the constitutional question was finally buried, but with polls suggesting that in 2026 there just might be a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, how long will that question be buried? And what about the Tories? A disastrous night in the UK and in Scotland, an all-time low share of the vote, despite the fact they managed to hold onto most of the seats. So let's start it all off, Alex, by looking at that Labour landslide. It was a landslide, though, that was delivered in part by the vagaries of the electoral system.
No, that's absolutely right. And yes, you're also correct, I think, Bernard, to note that this is the time of the calendar year where you look back on it, you take stock, and that phrase favoured by John Major, of course, after the 1992 general election, and inevitably these kinds of reflections on the year that's passed and so on, it leads you to the sort of Scotch and rye, to the I Am Jolly, the Reverend I Am Jolly's verdict and so on. Oh, it's been a hell of a year, and here we are again. And I think there's a slight feeling of that in Downing Street at present as well, isn't there? Because it turns out, and again, who knew about this? But it's something that that you would think new governments should know, but they all have to learn for themselves, effectively. Is that the difference between opposition, the difference between campaigning and governing is enormous. And for all that I think many people thought that this government had done the preparation work, had done all that it could to be ready for office, it turns out that it wasn't, and it wasn't enough. And some of that, I think, maybe reflects the fact that Rishi Sunak went to the country rather earlier than many people had thought. Lots of people were thinking it would be an autumn election, October, November. Instead, he goes in July, risks it all. There are an awful lot of unemployed former Tory MPs now who blame the Prime Minister for their loss of their seats. They think that this was a reckless move. I remember David Cameron said, well, it's certainly a bold one, which is, as we know, code for saying, well, I wouldn't have done that. And the new government has had a very, very difficult start. Keir Starmer's approval ratings are now sharply negative. He has got to Margaret Thatcher territory much more quickly than Margaret Thatcher did. Although, again, that example is, should remind us that a difficult beginning doesn't have to be terminal, does it? But if you had to isolate, Bernard, two or three things where you think the government has gone wrong, that has made life more difficult for itself than it would have to be, I suspect you would say the winter fuel payment would be one of them. Then the controversy over that to save £1.5 billion. But what else would you add to that list?
I think that the first thing before we get to sort of specifics, I think that it was a landslide, but we made the point earlier in the year when we were dissecting the election result. It was a different kind of landslide from the Blair landslide in 1997. The Blair landslide in 1997, there was a feel-good factor in the country at the time. There was a sense in which Tony Blair had sealed the deal with the voters, and for the whole of the first parliament of the three elections that Blair won, there was no midterm blues at all. Just midterm blues did not come at all in the whole of that parliament. There is a sense in which the country seemed to give Starmer, and this sounds a bizarre thing to say, they gave him a grudging mandate. How can it be grudging when the parliamentary majority is in excess of 170? Quite simply because Keir Starmer was elected on a share of the vote less than that was achieved by Jeremy Corbyn in a couple of elections. So it was a sense in which the nature of the electoral system is what turbocharged the victory. And in a sense, I think that the election in 2024 was a comment about a plague on both your houses. There was a sense in which there was absolutely no enthusiasm for the Conservatives, a bit more enthusiasm for Labour, but frankly, not much. And perhaps, Alex, there's even an echo in that election from what we're seeing in terms of the collapse of governments in France and Germany, which is that people are falling out of love with the established order, with the established large parties. And you're absolutely right to say that there have been one or two issues in which the new government have embarked upon policies which you can defend. I think they're capable of being defended in terms of the winter fuel allowance, although I personally think it was a complete and utter mistake. The issue of compensating the WASPy women, again, I think you can defend it on public expenditure grounds, and not all of the 3.6 million people affected necessarily lost out. So why would you compensate them all? You can make an argument for the government doing what it did. Here is the problem. Keir Starmer has a rather monotone voice. Rachel Reeves has a robotic voice. They are both presentationally extremely poor. And if you're going to eyeball the country with difficult decisions, you have to be an ace communicator. And the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are poor communicators. And very often what they have is the wrong message when they're actually trying to defend some of these policies. I mean, if we take the compensation one, which they're not going ahead with, if you're going to try and sell that, you have to be able to spell out what the opportunity cost to the government of spending £10 billion in compensation to WASPy women is, even though some of them, probably most of them, didn't actually lose out. You have got to spell out what it means for the health service, what it means for education, what it means in terms of your ability to grow the economy. And the simple fact is, and it is becoming painfully obvious with every passing day, that we have a Prime Minister who isn't politically sure-footed, but we've got a Prime Minister who is a very poor communicator.
Yes, I think that's a real problem. And, again, if you say that, as you come into government and you say that economic growth is the lodestone, the keystone, the central part of what we're going to do. In fact, everything we are going to do is going to be defined by the need to get economic growth, because that's the only way that we can fix the fiscal black hole that we pretend we've discovered on entering office of £22 billion. I say pretend because I think it was pretty obvious that the nation's finances were stretched well before the election. But nevertheless, if you're going to make growth the be-all and end-all, then when you have in your budget the central decision you take, Zoran, is to put £25 billion of tax increases onto the shoulders of business, then at the very least, even if you recognize and you're being charitable and you say, well, we understand why they have to take measures that are difficult and costly and expensive, and then, because of the particular nature of the hole in which the country finds itself, and so we understand that. Even if you make those allowances, then there is a tension between the government's stated objective, which is to get Britain building again, and to get growth into the economy, and heaping additional costs on business, and really quite substantial costs when you factor in the increase to the minimum wage and so on and so on. So, that contradiction, that tension, I would say, is something that hasn't been resolved. You're quite right, though, that more broadly in your analysis, I think, Bernard, that this has been a bad year for incumbents. This 2024 was a year of democracy in certain respects. More people were going to vote on planet Earth than in any previous year in human history because of elections in India, in the United States, and elsewhere. Well, Narendra Modi won in India, but in general, it's been a very, very bad year for incumbents. And we saw that obviously in the United States with the extraordinary presidential campaign, complete with assassination attempts, the defenestration of the sitting president, and of course, Donald Trump's re-election. But here, the sense that a new government would sweep away the sort of should we say malaise, a sense of sort of grumbling, dissatisfied fatalism, I think, which is currently what British politics is soaked in. You would hope, in theory, at any rate, that a new government would be able to sweep that aside. But you're right that Starmer and Rachel Reeves have not managed to do that. In the same, at the same time, so they've gone from, and there's been a change of approach by the government now. Instead of missions, we now have milestones, which are, of course, just means of measuring how far the government has got along the road on its missions. So, for instance, the milestone of how much you will have cut NHS waiting times by in England by such and such a point. That is more important than the milestone, the mission rather now. And I think that shows a political operation in Downing Street that is learning on the job. And to some extent, that is unavoidable. But it is a problem. And you're right, the communication, the vision thing, as George H.W. Bush once put it, that is something that Starmer clearly doesn't have. And he's very uncomfortable with politics, which is a problem for a prime minister.
All governments do U-turns. Absolutely every single government does a U-turn. The issue in politics is how you manage to do a U-turn without it looking like a U-turn. Or if you can't escape the obvious, you have to be able to explain your way out of it. And I think the problem is that the government, in some respects, I mean, early days, all this lord-alley donations and stuff made them look sleazy. And latterly on things like the compensation for the WASPy women, where Labour politicians were queuing up behind this campaign in opposition, they now look sleek-it. I mean, in a sense, the whole pitch at the election is we have to do politics differently. We have to have change. And it simply looks like a continuation of the kind of behaviour patterns which did for the Conservatives in the last Parliament. And it's that notion of sleek-itness which I think is beginning to take hold. Labour were absolutely right in opposition to say that you cannot turbocharge economic growth unless there is a very clear concordat between government and private sector about how you grow the economy. And as we've said before, quite a lot of senior figures in business backed Labour because they were persuaded that on the issue of growth and some of the macroeconomic fundamentals, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer got it. But what they didn't tell business was that in terms of the plugging of the black hole and the public finances, in terms of the increases in public expenditure, particularly for health, every last penny of that would be put on the shoulders of business. That was almost an article of bad faith within a matter of months of the government coming to office. And, they desperately need growth because if they don't get growth, they will be in big problems. But look at the economic outlook. We are now looking at a possible recession. Not a very deep recession, but a possible technical recession. We've got inflation creeping up again at 2.6%. Some people think it will be higher in January, which will act as some sort of brake on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England in terms of cutting interest rates. Growth at the moment is absolutely non-existent, and business are unhappy. When you start taking all of those fundamentals together, it's pretty difficult to make the case that in 2025, the government are going to be able to turn some of this stuff around. But I think that the thing which is fundamental about what they've not been able to do is that they have not had a persuasive narrative. And I think the reason that there is no persuasive narrative is that neither the Chancellor or the Prime Minister fundamentally are political communicators. It is possible to take a difficult set of circumstances and to debate your way out of it, or explain your way out of it, or get the country on side by being frank with them. But the country has to have a degree of respect for the politicians that are giving them tough messages. And the problem is, as we said about the election result, the problem was that Starmer didn't actually seal the deal before election day.
Yeah. And in politics, of course, one person's difficulty is somebody else's opportunity. And that, I suspect, may help explain why we have seen a startling transformation in certain respects, at least for the time being. We'll see how long it endures in 2025 and then into 2026 in the fortunes of the Scottish National Party, which was obliterated in the general election. 38 seats that's been held by the SNP at the previous general election were won by opposition parties in this election. And I suppose, obviously from a Scottish point of view, in terms of our domestic politics, the big event of the year was a change in First Minister. We have talked previously quite a bit, obviously, about that, about Humza Yousaf, about the collapse of the Butte House Agreement with the Greens, the way in which Humza Yousaf managed to shoot himself in the foot, if you like, and bring down his own government. But we haven't perhaps talked quite enough about what's happened since then. And so my question to you, Bernard, I suppose would be is, what is your view on how John Swinney has done in the, 7 or so months that he has been leader of the SNP and a surprise recalled to the colours First Minister?
I think the first thing to say is that probably I would have said, if Humza Yousaf hadn't shot himself in the head as well as the foot, started off the foot and then went for the head. If he would, if he'd still been in office, I was fully expecting that John Swinney would have announced that he wasn't standing at the election in 2026, because when John Swinney says that family comes first for him, I think he absolutely means that. I've known John Swinney a long time, and to a certain extent, what you see is what you get. And he's not an exciting politician. He's not a politician that's given to great rhetorical flair. He's not, doesn't carry himself with the gravitas of an Alex Salmond or the quick fire debating charisma that Nicola Sturgeon had. He is, I suppose, there is something of the bank manager about John, but there also is something of the safe pair of hands, that he's not going to do anything particularly rash. I think that he inherited a mess. I think the election was cataclysmic for the SNP. And the day after the general election, he must have sat in Butte House and said to himself, what have I done? And of course, he accepted the responsibility of leadership because John Swinney is a party man above all else, and his roots within the SNP and the number of people that he's known for a long period of time. Remember, he was National Secretary of the SNP when he was 23 years of age. In many respects, his roots go far deeper than either Nicola Sturgeon's or Alex Salmond's. And the pressure on him, therefore, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of the party. Well, the message was, now is the time for this good man to come to the aid of the party. And I suspect there was very little that he could do during the course of the general election campaign to avert the disaster that unfolded. But, in defeat, normally you would say to yourself, we've got to recalibrate what we're doing. He's had to recalibrate nothing because, as I said on the last podcast, it's simply a matter of allowing the Labour government in London to stagger from one crisis to another, thereby rendering perhaps, and I put it no more stronger than that, Scottish Labour unelectable, not unelectable, but unlikely to be the largest party after 2026. But everything in that regard is completely and utterly fluid. I think we both agree you can't call 2026.
No, absolutely not. It's far too soon for that. And the possibility that there could be, if you like, no easy way of forming a government after that election, I think, is still more likely than any other potential scenario. But you're right. I mean, Swinney has steadied the SNP ship. He has spent a lot of time doing what Linton Crosby, the Australian political strategist who guided David Cameron to a couple of election victories, calls out scraping the barnacles off the boat. That is to say, getting rid of stuff that slows you down, gets in the way. So, we are not having things like, highly protected marine areas, closing large portions of the sea to all human activity. We are not having a ban on wood burning stoves, as was being consulted on and favoured by the government previously. These are comparatively small issues, but they are quite heavily symbolic ones. And they give the impression to voters of saying, they invite voters to say, what the hell are you people doing? These are not important things. This is, proper waste of government energy and resources, and you're interfering in our lives too much. You are treading too heavily in our lives, which is, of course, something that Keir Starmer was saying about politics over the last 10 years. That politics was too intrusive. There was too much of it, and that one of the things he was going to do was to try and calm things down, to have a politics, as he puts it, that treads more lightly on people's lives. Now, in a curious way, John Swinney is actually achieving that in Scotland, whereas Keir Starmer is struggling to manage that in the UK as a whole. And so you have a government that in certain respects is less ambitious than its predecessors, but it is not making the same kind of mistakes. It is not booting the ball into its own net to the same degree. And that, I think, reflects Swinney's experience, obviously. I mean, if you look at him in the Holyrood Chamber at the moment, he is never happier than when cutting deals to pass a budget. That is his sweet spot, his happy place, if you like. And I think you see that in Holyrood in the exchanges towards the end of the year and so on, that actually, he enjoys that aspect of the political process, and he's quite good at it. And I would expect him to be able to pass his budget quite easily in February when the time finally comes. But, beneath all of that, so the SNP oddly ends 2024 in much finer fettle than seemed likely or plausible as recently as July. But within that, there are still certain changes and so on. For instance, if you look at the speech that John Swinney gave just before St Andrew's Day, now this would, ordinarily be a great rallying call. Independence isn't mentioned at all. The Scottish government has stopped talking about independence. It has learned that lesson, I think, from the general election, which is not that the cause has disappeared completely, but in an election where you lose 38 seats and so on, it is ridiculous to talk about independence as though you had not lost those 38 seats. You had not had that kind of huge rebuke from the voting public. And so, although the issue can, of course, return at some point in the future, there is a widespread acceptance and agreement across Scottish politics, like it or not, that there will be no movement on the national question in this Westminster Parliament.
Now, as you know, podcasts rely on the support of listeners and sponsors. And I'm delighted to say that we are teaming up with the Inverary Inn, a venerable institution in Scottish hospitality, and somewhere, I'm pleased to say, both Alex and I frequent when we visit.
Yes, and if you're not familiar with Inverary, it's one of the most picturesque coastal towns in Scotland, with its historic streets and castle, which have featured in many Hollywood films. It's only an hour's drive or so from Glasgow and a couple of hours across country from Edinburgh through some of the most picturesque scenery in the country.
And if you go there, you really can't miss the Inverary Inn. It's very, very conveniently located, and of course, with those absolutely stunning views of Loch Fyne. And we are also delighted that the good people at the Inverary Inn are teaming up with us with this special offer for all of the listeners and viewers to the Ponsonby and Massie podcast.
If you book a stay between now and March 2025, they will include a £25 dining credit to enjoy some of the hotel's wonderful Highland fare. Just quote the code podcast2024. That's podcast 2024.
Yep, that's a generous offer, and it's one which I am going to take them up on.
To find out more, just visit www.inverary-in.co.uk or give them a call. As ever, terms and conditions apply.
Yeah. I think the issue, and as we sit here at the end of 2024, I think there's a couple of questions worth posing, because they will impact on 2025 and certainly 2026. What will 2026 be fought on? Will it be fought on the Scottish Government's record? If the 2026 campaign is fought on the government's record, then 2024 has continued to be a problematic year for the SNP, because there is no discernible turnaround on things like hospital waiting times, for example. We have had government pledge after government pledge as it relates to the motorway network and the upgrading of the motorway network, shelved, ditched, kicked into the to the long grass. There is a lot, if you were going through the record on the economy, on public services, on growth, where you would say this government cannot get re-elected defending that record. And an effective opposition, which goes after them on that record, should be able to get over the line. So if the 2026 election is fought on the issues germane to the competence of the Holyrood Parliament and the record of the government over what will have been 19 years at that point, then there is the possibility that Labour would emerge as the largest party. But as we've said before, you simply can't hermetically seal everything in Scottish politics and say that nothing that happens in a UK level ever impinges or impacts on politics, electoral politics here. And if John Swinney can say, look at what we've had at Westminster these last couple of years, this is a party that is continuing with no winter fuel payments, and we've taken action to mitigate this. There's a two-child benefit cap here. There's a sluggish UK economy. The Labour Party are doing things which are deeply unpopular. Oh, and by the way, much of what they're doing, Anas Sarwar doesn't actually agree with. So you cannot get the leader of Scottish Labour and the leader of UK Labour on the same page on many of these issues. Do we really wish to trust Anas Sarwar to take Scotland forward when you'll be picking a fight with his colleagues in London because he seems to disagree with them on fundamentals? So the issue, I suppose, is what will 2026 be fought on? And the consequence of 2024 is that there is now a series of issues where Anas Sarwar and Keir Starmer are not on the same page. And by default, although you are right that the constitutional question is not centre stage, the constitutional question will not be centre stage in 2026. If the SNP can turn 2026 into a referendum on the UK Labour government and get elected, even if independence is only a line in the 2026 manifesto, and if there is an outcome in the 2026 election where there is a pro-independence parliament, then like it or not, it's back on the agenda by dint of the electoral arithmetic. And the irony will be that the party that may well turbocharge a majority for India in 2026 is Labour at Westminster.
Yeah, indeed. Elections tend to be a choice, don't they? The governing party says more of the same, let's finish the job. And the opposition party says time for a change. And if the opposition party is sufficiently credible to form a government, then it has a chance of doing so. But it is, the old truism that governments tend to lose elections first and then they are won by the opposition, has a good deal of validity to it. the nature of devolution and the architecture of the British constitutional settlement at present and so on is such, however, that it works in a slightly different way, in as much as if you have a party like the SNP in power at Holyrood, so it offers at a Scottish parliamentary election two messages. First, it says, give us the tools to finish the job. More of the same, but it also offers change because it stands in power and in opposition simultaneously. It is in opposition to whoever happens to be in government in London. And so it can it can play both sides of the house, if you like. And that is an immensely favourable situation for the SNP to be in. And it's a situation that only the SNP can really take advantage of in Scottish politics. It's not a path that's really open to anybody else. And so it offers change vis-a-vis Labour in Westminster and, let us finish the job in terms of the powers devolved to Holyrood. So it is harder for Labour to win the change argument in Scotland than it is for Labour to win the change argument at a UK level. And so one of the things that we will need to see over the next 12 months and so on is the progress that Anas Sarwar is able to make at refocusing political discussion in Scotland, not on the Labour government's difficulties in the House of Commons and Whitehall, but on the Scottish government's difficulties here at home. And so that does mean NHS waiting lists. It does mean transport. It does mean economic growth. It does mean all of these things, particularly those things for which the Scottish government is responsible. And chief amongst those is the NHS. That if you still have a situation where you have 100 times more people in Scotland waiting 2 years for an NHS appointment and treatment than you do in England, and that's 1,000 times more people per capita, actually, then that is disastrous for the Scottish government. But if the Scottish government can make some progress on some of those issues, then Swinney's chances of actually cobbling together some kind of government, whether it's a formal coalition or a strong minority government post 2026, become much more plausible.
Yeah, and we've had both Anas Sarwar and Jackie Bailey on the podcast relatively recently. Now, I wouldn't have expected them to start writing their manifesto for 2026 on the podcast. And whilst I think that they diagnose a number of the problems relatively persuasively and relatively well, we'll have to see what the nature of the offer is. And the danger for them is that they may well have a package of policies in 2026 which may well be attractive, but the issue is how credible will they be seen if the issue of what the Labour government at Westminster is doing is the prevalent factor at that election. I suspect at some point, actually, I'm posing these questions: will it be dominated by the record of Labour at Westminster, or will it be dominated by the record of the SNP at Holyrood? I suspect the honest answer to is it'll be dominated by all of that. Labour will be concentrating their fire on the SNP, and the SNP will be concentrating their fire on UK Labour and saying that the only way to protect Scots from the worst excesses of what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are doing is to vote SNP. And of course, what we can comfortably predict in 2026 is that there'll be a lot of talk about Labour and there'll be a lot of talk about the SNP, because the polls would suggest it's one of these two parties that will be the major party. What people are not talking about, of course, at the moment is the role of the Tories. Now, on a UK level, they have a new leader. On a Scottish level, they have a new leader. The extent to which they can, I don't think they'll make any progress in 2026. I think the only issue is how far they will fall back. There is the still unknown quantity of Reform UK, and just whether or not these 2 or 3 opinion polls would suggest that they are going to get MSPs elected, whether or not by 2026 the phenomenon of 2024 is still redolent, still around, and that could actually be a plague in the houses of all of the mainstream parties, because as we've said, there was no great enthusiasm for Starmer. He didn't seal the deal. There is a sense in which throughout Europe, established parties are losing out. So if Reform UK does do reasonably well, it may well be at the expense not of just the Conservatives, although it may well disproportionately affect the Conservatives. It may well be at the expense of all of the parties. So, in a sense, Alex, Russell, difficult job going into an election, given that they've had the lowest ever share of the vote at an election, and given that most of the attention will be on the SNP and Labour. So, the lessons of 2024 for the Scottish Tories, in your view?
Well, I think they're in a very difficult position because, in one sense, they're freed from the responsibility of being in government in London. And so the Tories don't have to spend as much time defending things that are unpopular in Scotland, that have been, if you like, policies introduced at a UK level. So they're off that hook. The trouble is they're now on the hook of irrelevance, which is that nobody's actually very interested in anything the Scottish Conservative Party has to say at present. And partly as a result of that, it actually has very little to say about anything, really. I mean, Russell Findlay is quite an interesting figure. He's not a person from a traditional political background. He's not steeped in politics. He's not steeped in the Conservative Party. But and you see he brings what he likes to call sort of common sense conservatism on. So he's going big on law and order issues, on criminal justice issues, which reflects his own background as a crime reporter. That is probably the subject where he is most comfortable and where he thinks he can land some heavy punches on the Scottish government. But is this the sort of thing that is likely to cut through with voters as a whole? And I would suspect the answer to that is quite obviously no, it isn't. And that the Scottish Conservatives then are no longer really a national party. They are a party whose support is ever more concentrated in the northeast and in the south of Scotland, and out with those areas, Tory support has melted away. And I don't really see 2025 as being a year in which the Conservatives make significant progress in recapturing its relevance in the Central Belt, even in, which it has to at some point if it's to be a serious rather than a merely marginal or regional player in Scottish politics. It has ceded that territory, and I don't see it coming back right now.
Yeah, I mean, from the sort of high point of 1955 and 50% of the popular vote, and much of it in terms of parliamentary representation, it came from all of the major cities, the central belt of Scotland. There would have been a time when the city of Edinburgh was the most conservative in the whole of the UK, but of course there was that very steep decline in Conservative Party fortunes during the Thatcher years, and they've never really regained, that position where they were commanding about more than a third of the Scottish vote. That was a long time ago. And I think you're right, actually, to make the point that they are now really a regional force. That is equally true of the Liberal Democrats, not even a regional force. They're a force in some
there are pockets of support. Very small pockets
of support. And I mean, if Liberal Democrats really want to know how far they have fallen, they simply have to go to the most recent elections, either at Westminster or for Holyrood, and look at the number of lost deposits right across a great swathes of the country, but particularly in the Central Belt. And we were seeing this with the Conservatives at the last election as well. I mean, the Tories did get a little bit of a bounce after the independence referendum, where even in the Central Belt of Scotland, although they weren't actually winning weren't winning any seats, nevertheless, their share of the vote in a number of constituencies in the Central Belt was upward of 20%. You were getting back to the kind of share of the vote that they got many moons ago. But that entirely was as a result of the polarization of the constitutional question. And at 12.5% of the popular vote at the last election, I mean, Russell Findlay's job, and in that sense, I mean, you don't have to worry about seats. The electoral system at Holyrood will reward you for votes in a way that it doesn't at Westminster. But he has to be polling a lot higher than 12.5%. But I suspect that the Conservatives are absolutely headed for third place. And nothing that I've heard from him to date. And I think you're right that he goes for populist issues. Back in those days when the Tories did poll pretty highly in Scotland, they were known as tenement Tories, and they were championed by people like Teddy Taylor, who himself was an extremely sort of populist Tory, representing Glasgow Cathcart up until 1979. But there is a sense in which I think the Conservatives are out of kilter where mainstream Scottish opinion lies, and it would help if they could maximise the votes of those who are instinctively centre-right, pro-business, small state, lower taxes. But just I think as there is a problem with the communication skills of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the communication skills on the Conservative front bench at Holyrood are not great either.
Yeah, and I think it's exacerbated actually by changing news patterns as well. Crime, law and order, soft touch justice, etc., etc. Those are excellent issues in the days when everybody read newspaper, particularly read tabloid newspapers and so on. You could get, that's a situation where you could see the Daily Mail, the Daily Record, the Sun getting behind Tory campaigns on law and order and so on, highlighting inadequacies or weaknesses in the justice system and policing and so on, in ways that would cut through with the electorate as a whole. And this is something that perhaps we'll talk about a bit more next year and so on, is the impact of changing media consumption patterns on politics, actually. I think the decline in relevance of the newspapers, and particularly the mass market newspapers, means they don't set the agenda to the same degree they once did. And it's harder for issues of this sort to cut through with the electorate. That is to say that even if you can get the media on side and listening to what it is you have to say on these issues, as Russell Findlay obviously hopes he does as a former journalist, he understands how the newspaper business works. Even if you get that, it doesn't necessarily transfer into being the kind of subject about which people are talking the whole time because of the decline in relevance and weight and influence of the mass market newspapers in particular. And so I think in that sense, he may be fighting, if you like, the right war, but he's got very out-of-date artillery.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes of this podcast in reviewing 2024 has been the lack of communication skills of our leaders, which help, in a sense, to find the problems that they find themselves in. Of course, one individual who is completely incoherent, absolutely incoherent in terms of communicating political messages, is Donald Trump. And yet the reverse is true when it comes to Trump. He is an example of somebody who is quite literally incoherent. And if you read back what he said, it makes no sense at all. But he seems to be the one politician, the dafter he gets, the more popular he gets.
Well, yes, I mean, you're right that on the one hand, Trump's speeches are incoherent. He talks a lot of nonsense. But at the same time, nobody ever fails to understand what it is he means. And so to that extent, he actually, communicates surprisingly clearly. And again, Trump, that's his election is again a sort of revolt against incumbents that we've seen in most elections across the Western world this year, and as we would expect to see in elections next year. I mean, the result of the German election that's coming up in February is going to be very interesting in this respect. There are a number of factors I think that that help contribute to Trump's return to Pennsylvania Avenue, to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. Many of them, in the first place, you have the Democrats saying up until July that are plainly past it, and Gaga Joe Biden was fit not just to be president this November, but in November 2028 as well, which was something that just insulted voters' intelligence, because they could see quite obviously that this was not likely to be the case. And so that weakened the Democratic Party in the first place. Aspects of Biden's record also made it more difficult for Kamala Harris to win once she stepped in at more or less the last moment. the impact of inflation on Americans' sense of their own economic opportunities and so on was extremely significant. The fact that the American economy has actually continued to motor ahead and vastly outperform other Western economies and so on is neither here nor there. That is not how many voters perceived it. And as a result, they were happy to lend their vote to a sort of mad as hell, let's blow it all up kind of candidate who, even if they don't like aspects of his personality or his platform, at least offers a sort of clarity of change. And there's sort of, as I say, the sort of mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore network type appeal that Trump has, does speak to something quite sort of atavistic within the American political tradition. Trump isn't quite as exceptional as we sometimes like to think he is. But a combination of personal and political and economic weaknesses from the Democratic Party, it seems to be, plus the nature of incumbency that in 2024 was more of a handicap than its traditional attribute. It used to be, traditionally being the incumbent is you would rather be the incumbent actually than the opposition in elections. This was a year in which being the incumbent actually came with a penalty, not an advantage.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the rhetoric around protectionism and tariffs and trade wars and all of this kind of stuff actually plays in some of the manufacturing states, which Biden had to win and didn't. Of course, a lot of attention in 2025 will be how UK-US relationships go, and of course, the Prince of Darkness himself, Peter Mandelson, has been appointed as the UK ambassador. And I read, I'm abroad at the moment, escaping the horrible weather, but I read from my newspapers this morning that he will enlist the support of Nigel Farage in paving the way for maximizing the benefits that have to be had from this relationship. Well, hell on you, Peter Mandelson. If you seriously think that you can bring Nigel Farage into the tent, and at some point he would piss all over you, then you've learned nothing from your own black arts in politics. I think that was, by the by, a cracker's appointment from Starmer. Again, another example, in my view, of a complete and utter lack of political touch. I think it would have been better simply to have put a career diplomat in there, putting somebody who was a high-profile politician in previous administrations and a controversial high-profile Labour politician who had to resign not once but twice, who has said things about Donald Trump which are undoubtedly true, but already in Washington, I think his card is marked. So we'll watch that relationship with interest in 2025, but. I think that's us about 3/4 of an hour. We've been wobbling.
Well, I mean, and while obviously the people will be clamoring for more, but this is perhaps an absolute moment at which to thank them for their support, for listening to us in our first months of this podcast in 2024. We've learned a lot. We've had a lot of fun doing it. We hope you have enjoyed at least some of the episodes and that you will stay with us in 2025 as we have a number of plans and ambitions for the coming year, which we hope will make the podcast very exciting. So thank you for all of your support. As always, if you would like to sponsor the podcast, we'd be very interested in hearing from you. If you would like to share it with friends and family and so on and recommend it to other people, that would also be a delightful thing. But we hope that you are well and that you have a very happy Christmas and a splendid New Year, and we shall see you in 2025.
Well, I am not in the UK because I like to escape Christmas.
So there is the spirit of the season.
It's a time of great fraud. It is a time of unbelievable fraud and hypocrisy, and I will have none of it. So I am not wishing anyone a Merry Christmas. But if you're with your family, have a splendid time. Keep listening. Alex and I have really enjoyed launching this podcast in 2024, and we've got one or two ideas about not only refreshing it but taking it forward in 2025. So stick with us, but for this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. From me, it is goodbye.
And who'd have thought I wouldn't be the Grinch on this podcast? It's goodbye from me as well.